And welcome to this webinar. My name is Sonia Blanks, Director of Product Marketing here at Nucleus Security, and I will serve as the moderator for today's session. I'm excited to welcome each of you joining us online, especially those of you that have already started to respond to our prompt in the chat box. Thank you and welcome. And I see that we just dropped that in there. So if you have time and can just give us quick feedback there, we'd appreciate it. I'm also excited to welcome, introduce, and guide the discussion between not one or two, but three industry experts that are all passionate about transforming vulnerability management within organizations today. This webinar is part of our ongoing effort to be a leader and educator in the vulnerability management space. Today's panelists will touch on the fundamental issues in vulnerability management and why our work will never truly be done. They will also provide practical tips to effectively move your program to a more mature and manageable state starting today. We only have an hour, and my goal is to make this session the most valuable vulnerability management panel you've ever experienced. I'll need your help though. So submit questions using the Q&A button below or react with emojis and feedback via chat throughout the session. Now let's get you warmed up. Drop an emoji now, any emoji, into the chat box if you're ready to meet our panelists. Joining me today as part of the best looking group of panelists I've ever seen, our CEO and co-founder of Nucleus Security, Steve Carter, who spent his career building vulnerability management programs and technologies for large enterprises and still plays an active role in R&D at Nucleus today. He's a serious bourbon collector owning over 100 bottles, a guitar hopeful just 20 years in the making, and a lifetime Taekwondo champion thanks to his first and only tournament at age 12. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me, Sonia. Great to be here.
Next, there's COO and co-founder of Nucleus Security, Scott Kuffer, who spent his career building products to solve real cybersecurity problems faced by industry professionals and leads the overall product vision for Nucleus. He's a motorcycle enthusiast, owning over 10 motorcycles in his life so far, with no two ever at the same time, a guitar player, though he and Steve have never played together, and quite the risk taker who once ran, or rather hobbled, a half marathon at age 21 after fracturing his hip in a bounce house just 3 days before. I don't even know where to start. Welcome, Scott.
What's going on, Sonia? Great to be here. We'll save that story for another day.
And lastly, co-founder and CISO of Next Level3, independent security consultant and SANS Institute author and instructor, David Hazar, who's held many technical job roles and specializes in vulnerability management and application and cloud security. He's a snowboard and ski lover, a proud father to a pole vaulting high school track and field daughter and athlete, and one grateful human for never having broken a bone, at least not so far. I haven't either. Knock on wood, David. Welcome.
Yeah. Thanks, Sonia. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, we'll start with a question for you, David. We've been able to identify vulnerabilities for over 20 years now, yet continue to fail at addressing fundamental issues and root cause problems in vulnerability management within many organizations. All three of you have built successful businesses in this industry and dedicated your careers to improving these ongoing issues. So why is vulnerability management such a challenge or problem, and why are we still talking about it 20 plus years later?
Well, I could talk about this for 5 days, right? I do have a 5-day course where we do talk about this, but ultimately, I think the way we've dealt with vulnerabilities historically has been somewhat reactive. We have this find and fix mentality where we're leveraging tools and other techniques to find vulnerabilities, and then we've got to get all hands on deck to fix them. And that approach just doesn't scale. We're finding more and more vulnerabilities as the years progress. So we're getting better. Our tools and our processes and our people are getting better at finding the vulnerabilities, which means we have more to fix. And that's just not scaling. And that doesn't even account for the fact that with cloud and everything else, the scale of what we do have to protect is getting much bigger as well. And so we just need to be more proactive. And then the other big thing that I have seen in my career is when working with different companies, there's a lot of fundamental issues with how we do things, not necessarily related to vulnerability management, like how we manage systems and applications that prevent us from remediating all vulnerabilities and even a sizable portion of our backlog. And so we've got to focus on acknowledging first that we have an issue, which is sometimes the failure, right? We don't document the exceptions or the exclusions that we have within our environment. And then, once those are documented and recognized, how do we have a 5-year, 10-year plan for not still being in this situation, right? So what is the long-term plan? Because we're not going to solve it overnight. It's taken us 20 years to get here. It's still not solved. But if we don't lay that foundation, if we don't start putting that plan in place to solve some of the issues, why we're not as proactive as we should be, then we're still going to be here in next 5 or 10 years.
Well, let's hope not.
Yeah,
Steve,
hopefully not.
Steve, this makes me think about you in the very early days. Not many people know the full background story of Nucleus Security, including the fact that really the earliest versions of Nucleus started as Steve's side project, while you were working as a practitioner. So take us back to the early days of that story. What were you dealing with then? What motivated you to start building a tool? Was any of what David just saying resonating with you and the same even 20 years ago for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And happy to do that. But we'll add a little bit of context there because you say 20 years. And when I think of 20 years ago, back then, vulnerability management pretty much just meant vulnerability scanning, right? When you said vulnerability management, most people thought of scanning. And I think today that has changed a lot. And now most organizations understand that it's much, much broader than that. It's more about, or it's also about how you organize all the vulnerability information you have in your enterprise, how you enrich it with other information to make it more valuable, how you share it securely, how you control access to it, all these other aspects of vulnerability management that are really now on the table that people really weren't talking about 20 years ago. But yeah, so going back to my story, you're absolutely right. It was kind of a pet project of mine, and this goes all the way back to, I guess, about 2010, 2012, when the very kind of first iterations of Nucleus were really starting to form up. And like a lot of organizations back then tried to do, the organizations I was working with, they're primarily federal agencies. And we tried to build our own vulnerability management platform on top of a SIEM, actually, which again, a lot of organizations have done. We had a lot of ideas for functionality we wanted to automate within the context of vulnerability management. There wasn't really a platform out there we could just go out and purchase to do what we wanted to do. So we tried building our own on top of a SIEM. We grossly underestimated the level of effort involved, the cost involved. And so we ended up coming to the conclusion that, I ended up coming to the conclusion that to accomplish what we needed and wanted to accomplish, we're just gonna have to develop kind of a purpose-built solution from the ground up for vulnerability management. So Nucleus was born. We've technically the software to date, Nucleus platform, has been in development for, I guess, about 6 or 7 years, even though we didn't officially launch as a business and a product until about 4.5 years ago. But yeah, that's kind of the story in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying part of that as well. I think that was highly valuable for everyone listening. And so, Scott, you're typically very hands-on and connected to our product and customers, and recently said better vulnerability management can have a huge impact on the safety and security of the world as a whole. So when you're talking to customers, when you're thinking about our product, what blockers are you seeing for better and more effective vulnerability management within these organizations, or like most common problems for remediation teams currently?
Yeah, first of all, I just have to appreciate how dramatic that sounds when you actually say it out loud. When you write things down, it doesn't seem, for whatever reason, it doesn't feel like you're making it as big of a deal. But
there's feeling there.
That's right. Yes. Now I'm going to tell you about why it's important. But no, so obviously at Nucleus, we work with a ton of organizations of all different sizes. And, my entire career basically has been vulnerability management. So it's like one of those things where like all I've ever done is focus in this area. And I don't know whether or not I'm proud of that, but here we are. So you start to see patterns when you work with tons of organizations, right? And what we have really noticed is that the problems of vulnerability management in the early days were really around, hey, how do we get more data? How do we understand what needs to be fixed? And then, and then there was this sort of like black box of like, once we figure out what we need to get fixed, it would just we would just fix it, right? Like you sort of, that old adage of just draw the owl. right? Just do it, right? Just fix it. And so as we've gotten more robust as an industry, the problems have shifted further down into the vulnerability management pipeline. And the problems that we see most organizations have tend to not be what I would consider vulnerability management challenges as much as they are organizational challenges, right? So like if you think about a vulnerability analyst who historically 10 years ago, their job was just to run as many scans as possible. And back then it was quarterly, now it's, continuously, et cetera. But now it's a situation where, well, they're not the ones that are able to fix the vulnerabilities, and they don't necessarily, their incentives don't align with the incentives of the organization as a whole or the teams as a whole. So how do you maneuver your way through an organization to get alignment, right? It's as much a product management, project management challenge as it is vulnerability management challenges. And obviously, just like David, I could talk for all, of 5 days about this specifically, but we see that it's not just technical challenges, it's just as much political challenges, organizational challenges, and things like that.
Yeah, I think someone in the chat said asset management, which is definitely a big challenge, right? If you're not doing a good job of asset management. But yeah, I mean, I'll just add to what Scott's saying. I'm really obsessed over communication lately, and I'd say communication, especially in larger organizations, among the right people and stakeholders in a vulnerability management program are one of the biggest challenges that I see, and that can surface at very low levels between development teams and AppSec teams. It can surface at really high levels between executives and board members and kind of everything in between. So yeah, I mean, I think these are some of the hardest problems to solve, probably more challenging than a lot of the technical issues, just changing these communication patterns and cultural problems and things like that.
Yeah. And I think we're probably going to talk about prioritization and things today.
We are.
And that's just one of many, right? Yeah. We're going to talk about prioritization.
It's weird.
Is that something we're supposed to do?
No way we're going to leave that off. Definitely
right.
not.
Yes.
Before we go there, though, I think we have a good segue here into something I'm sure a lot of folks in the audience want to hear a little bit more about from David, and that is the SANS VM maturity model. For anyone on this webinar today that doesn't know, David is one of the co-authors of this. And so for everyone listening, could you tell us just a little bit more about it, including what it is, why it was created, who it's for, David?
Sure. Right around 3 years ago now, I think Jonathan Risto and I created a course, Management 516, in the leadership curriculum for SANS called Building and Leading Vulnerability Management Programs. And as we went through and talked to students about what it takes to succeed in vulnerability management, which we have like a five-phase model for looking at all of the different components of our program, which, going back to what Scott's saying earlier, like we don't have control over all 5 phases. Like there's other people that are executing some of these phases, but we need to improve in all of these phases. So we have the PACT model, which is prepare, identify, analyze, communicate, and treat. Well, as we went through and discussed that model and what it takes to succeed with these students, they're like, well, how do we measure up? Like, what are we supposed to be doing in each of these areas, and even the capabilities within those areas? And that's really what caused us to create this maturity model, is a way for people to measure how they're doing. And then for the last couple of years, we've done a vulnerability management survey where we've also included the maturity model. So if you look at the survey results from 2022, then you'll actually get to see how you compare to those that are responding to that survey against that maturity model. And so we really followed the Carnegie Mellon maturity model as closely as possible. When you get into some of the more technical aspects of the program, we needed to deviate a little bit, but you've got, your ad hoc level 1 state where you don't really have anything. And then at the managed state, at level 2, you're starting to think about it, put things together, but it's not consistent. At level 3, you're more defined, like you have all the requirements. People generally know and are aware of what they're supposed to do. And then at level 4, quantitatively managed, right, you're actually have metrics and measurements to see, are we actually doing the things that we say that we're doing? And level 5 at optimizing, that's really where you get into a lot of the automation, and that leads to more consistency in following those requirements. It's where you solve some of the bigger challenges that you're dealing with and try to like scale and get to the next level. And one thing that I want to be clear about is, even though there are the 5 levels, don't hesitate to start measuring early, right? If you haven't defined all your requirements, that doesn't mean you can't measure the ones that you already have. And don't hesitate to automate as well before you reach those higher levels, because that can pay huge dividends, right? If there is something that you have to do that's a requirement, and it's one of the few requirements that you have right now that just is a pain and you hate doing it, well, if there's a way, if it's consistent enough, if there's a pattern that you can identify and you can automate the solution or the execution of that requirement, then do it. Don't wait for level 3 and level 4 to be completely done before you move on.
Awesome. Thank you, David.
So
Go ahead, Steve.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, we're big fans of the SANS vulnerability management maturity model. We recommend it to probably, it comes up in conversations with probably all of our customers. We point people towards it. Just because there's nothing really comparable that we found that does that good of a job to help organizations think about kind of all these different areas. But I will say, I think our exposure, at least my exposure to how it's actually used in practice is somewhat limited. So I am curious, David, do you get a feel for to what extent organizations are actually taking it, doing the assessments, and then I have to assume they're probably building out roadmaps for their program to, create projects and add new capabilities to their VM program. So do you get a feel that that's happening a lot, that it's been kind of adopted in that way?
I mean, definitely from the students that have gone through the class, we do get feedback that they are leveraging it and looking at it. So much so that Jonathan actually recently released the first version of kind of a self-assessment tool. It's just in Excel right now, where you can go through and kind of measure for the different categories. Because in the original maturity model, right, we wanted to make it consumable and be able to create slides, and we have a poster that the link is in chat where you can go grab that poster. And so we need to provide some descriptions of what those maturity levels are, but it's not really conducive to going in and saying, oh, I can answer yes to these 5 things, so I'm a level 3 or 4 or 3.5 or whatever it is. And so Jonathan's created that spreadsheet, and I'll have to look for his post so that I can get the link to share that, because I didn't think about doing that before. He just recently released it. So he goes into a little bit more of the specifics of the different questions that would maybe help you get to the different levels. And he's devised some scoring along with that to help you score yourself against the maturity model.
That's awesome. I actually wasn't aware that there was a tool out there. So that must have been.
Well, yeah. So it's like maybe in the last 3 weeks that.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Posted this. So
now I'm excited to take a look at it, because one of the things, I mean, if I were to critique the model, I think some of the guidance, if I'm just doing a self-assessment, could be pretty maybe subjective, right? I might read something that's being described and say, yeah, we kind of do that. I think we're good, right? I mean, I could see some of that happening. So maybe having some deeper questions, or maybe, being able to almost double click on some of those things and having an example of what an implementation of this might look like or something. I could see where that would be helpful. I could also see where even maybe, I don't know, maybe this is happening today. Are any kind of outside consultants that you know of performing assessments, kind of third-party assessment using the model?
I have not heard of that happening. I mean, they're welcome to. This is, public domain stuff. Where the maturity model is, right? In terms of we want people to look at it. We want people to leverage it. We'd love to get feedback, right? If you go through the self-assessment and you say, you know what, it's great that you think I'm a 4, but I don't really think I am. So I think these scores are a little bit high. This is the first version. I did paste the link in there. I should have provided a better description, but the LinkedIn link that was posted just a minute or so ago is the link to that post from Jonathan.
Perfect.
Awesome. Yeah,
Thank
sounds
you
like an
so much.
opportunity for
Yes.
for consultants. Yeah.
We'll be sharing a lot of links throughout the session, and there will be a moment at the end where we also share additional resources for everyone that's here. I just want to take a second before we move to the next question and thank everyone that's been engaging with us so far. We are seeing all of your comments and questions. There are questions coming in around automation, prioritization, metrics, and I promise we will touch on all of these topics today. And even if we don't get to everything, we are already talking about possibly doing a follow-up. And so I want to stop and go back to automation. And I'll let David start, but I do also want to hear some feedback here from Steve and Scott, because obviously Nucleus does a lot with automation. And so what role does automation play in an organization's ability to mature, and is automating patches enough?
Oh, automation has to be included everywhere. I mean, automating patches is one small piece, especially if we look at vulnerability management more holistically, right? Because automated patching, I mean, that is infrastructure vulnerabilities only. And we want to look at across infrastructure and the applications we're developing, even some of the, COTS applications and things that we're using in our environment. We want to know about all of those. Now, I guess the patches would apply to those COTS applications as well. But there may be other things that we have to do. And that's only for the treatment phase. There's a bunch of automation that we can do in the analyze and communicate phases to make things better for all of our stakeholders that we're asking to do more, right? Because a lot of times it's this shared responsibility model where security, they're paid to, at least in vulnerability management, we're paid to find these vulnerabilities and to kind of determine what the risk is for the organization and present that in a meaningful way to the stakeholders, who then are responsible for remediating those vulnerabilities. But that's where we kind of hopefully don't throw it over the fence, but that's where it kind of the role shifts. And now we're requiring teams that aren't dedicated to vulnerability management. It's probably not even explicitly called out in their job description. And we're asking them to do more. Like, yes, I realize that the company hired you to do this one thing and you're utilized 100% doing that thing. We need you to do 110, 120% to keep our organization secure. Now, there are ways to resolve that. You can work with the company to make that better, to make sure that this extra effort is getting recognized and accounted for, and so that we're not having people go the extra mile to keep the organization secure. But it takes conscious effort and an acknowledgement that we need that extra time, at least until, this goes back to automation. If we can get much of it automated, if we can go back to fundamentally, why are these vulnerabilities remaining in our environment? Why do we continue to have this problem? If we can solve some of those underlying challenges, which is the harder part, right, then maybe we can get to a point where it isn't such a burden on the organization. And you can look at like cloud vendors as an example of this. I don't think for the platform as a service offerings and software as a service in the cloud, a lot of these companies, they're probably not manually patching their systems or configuring them. Like they're scaled to a point where they have to rely on automation for that. And sure, things fail every once in a while, and we have problems, and we do have to manually respond to those, but we don't have to think about it 24/7. We don't have to react to reports and notifications and alerts about past due or overdue vulnerabilities. So we may not be there today, and it may take us a long time to get there, but can we change the way we build and develop our systems and applications so that we can manage this more easily, so that we're not placing as big a burden on our remediation teams?
Absolutely. Thank you, David. And so Steve, in your experience, what can or should be automated if you're using a vulnerability management solution?
Well, I think it depends. It probably depends on the size of the organization, I would say, to start with. When you think about really small companies and small businesses that don't have a really large IT footprint, maybe they're not developing custom software, right? Vulnerability management is a pretty simple process, and to some of David's points, like, yeah, you can set up tools pretty easily these days to automate patching for smaller and kind of less complex organizations. But I think as the organization grows and becomes larger, the more and more important automation becomes, and the more you just have to automate. It becomes a requirement, right? You literally just can't get the job done fast enough without automation. You can't hire enough people to do all the work required. So when I think about, in the largest enterprises, which were some of the enterprises I came from when I was kind of thinking about Nucleus and what was some of the impetus behind kind of getting the project started, it was really around, for me, aggregating and organizing all of the data that all of the scanning tools are generating, right? Because we've got a long list of scanning tools that are in use in most organizations, especially most large organizations across your cloud team, your AppSec team, your infrastructure teams. Then taking all that information, correlating it all to other information that you need to be able to prioritize it better. So business context and threat intelligence are really the two things that were front of mind when I was building Nucleus, taking the data from scanning tools and correlating it to these other feeds. And then, of course, tracking remediation status, calculating and tracking the right metrics to make sure you can kind of measure your program and measure the success of the program. And then, of course, some of the other stuff, automating the communication part of some of these vulnerability management processes, because a lot of times what I had found was that's where things get hung up. When we'll get into root cause analysis, I'm sure, here in a bit, but communication, just harping on that again. When you go and look at, where things tend to break down, especially if you just have kind of hotspots in your organization where it's like, hey, we've got a lot of teams, and in these 2 teams out of these 10, the numbers look a lot worse. The metrics look a lot worse. A lot of times you can drill into that and you'll find that there are just communication breakdowns. It might only be between 1 or 2 people, and it's like, hey, if we can just fix this communication path, we're good. And sometimes that means, automating the delivery of the right information to the people that need it, quickly. And so that's all the stuff that comes to my mind when I think about automation.
Thank you. And you brought up a good topic for us to move into, which is prioritization and root cause, Steve. So I will move next question to Scott. So Scott, CVSS and scanning tool risk scores are still the default go-to for many when it comes to prioritizing. Why is that, and why is or isn't it effective?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is actually a great segue from the last topic of conversation, which is when most people are thinking about how do you get the most vulnerabilities fixed, right? Which is where everybody tends to start when they're thinking about vulnerability management. You get a big old list, and then it's, well, how do we fix the most number of these things, right? That's kind of like the first logical step in thinking. And so what ends up happening is, well, great, well, there's too many here for us to actually fix right now. So which ones are we going to fix, right? And there are a ton of theories out there. There's a ton of different ways of prioritizing. But one that's been around probably since close to the beginning is this thing called CVSS, which everybody hopefully is familiar with. My theory and my reasoning as to why it's so widely used is just because it's easy. It's there and it's easy, right? Like if you look at any scanning tool and they generate some sort of CVE number, they're going to have the CVSS score associated with it, right? And it's not contextual to your environment. It's not the best, but it's easy and it's there, and you can use it you can use a single number and kind of track everything against that, right? So that's where CVSS really, I think, has taken hold. But what we're seeing is there are a ton of initiatives on improving CVSS. They're about to launch a version 4, which is meant to incorporate threat actors and things and better temporal metrics into the score. But that doesn't solve the fundamental problem, which is actually implementation of these things, right? So there's something called EPSS, which is meant to answer a very specific question around what do we think exploitation of this CVE is going to look like in the next 30 days. There are things like SSVC, where you can use decision trees to be able to answer what should your response be based on different attributes of vulnerabilities. So all these things exist, but the main reason we see most of these things being ineffective is actually because of inability to implement, right? And that's where it goes back to automation, where when we think about automation, it's not just, hey, let's go auto patch. It's every action that needs to occur inside of a VM process. So it could be communication issues. At the simplest level, it's, hey, we want to schedule a scan to run instead of having to manually go in and click every day to run a scan. It could be aggregating data. It could be, hey, we want to answer this one question every day or every week. And how do we do that at scale? And so things become very challenging at scale, which is why we see these fallbacks towards the easy button instead of the, call it the best way, right? And so I think the trick is, and I don't want to, I could caveat, or talk about this for a while too, but the trick is, how do we implement all of the data that already exists in your environment into these methodologies in order to create the best outcome? And my personal opinion is that I don't want to say it doesn't matter which of these frameworks you adopt. They all are decent, right? And you're going to be a much further along than you are today. But it's more about how do you actually get from where you are to being able to implement a framework for real, as opposed to picking the framework that you want.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott.
Can
I'll
I
just
jump in? Can
Yeah,
I jump
go
in
for it.
here?
Sure. Either one of you can.
Okay.
Go for it, David.
This is a topic I love to talk about. I mean, I agree with everything Steve and Scott are saying. And then, I don't know if I caught everything, but because I was responding to some questions in chat as well. But there's also the whole asset component. Like, nobody understands our organization like us, and so how do you prioritize without that context? And so that needs to be in there as well. And then my big thing, is prioritization without root cause analysis is less effective. And I like to give two concrete examples here from my experience, to help highlight some of the issues that companies can have with prioritization when they're not also doing good exception management, documentation, root cause analysis. The first one is, I was working with a big financial services company, and everybody, and I'll try and shorten this because I usually take a longer to get there, but I want to make sure we use all the time valuably. This organization had no problems with patch management. We were doing a maturity assessment. Everybody said it was great. It was amazing. As part of this assessment, though, we did a backlog review, and over 92% of their outstanding backlog was patchable vulnerabilities. Update Java, update Microsoft Windows servers and workstations, and update Red Hat. And so we had to go back and say, what's the deal? Like, everybody agrees that, and all your documentation says patch management is amazing. Why is it that you have all these vulnerabilities in your backlog? And well, for Java, we're sharing application servers, and we have older applications written in older versions of Java, so we can't patch those without affecting those applications. For the Microsoft servers and operating systems, it was legacy systems and Snowflake systems that we just can't touch or can't patch for whatever reason. And then some false positives where there's a registry entry that shows this vulnerable software is installed, but there's no binary there. And so couldn't really execute, but it's not really vulnerable. It's just an orphaned registry entry. And then for the Red Hat systems, it was, they didn't have enough engineers to do a monthly patching cycle. So they did a rolling 3 months, where always 2/3 of the servers were out of date in terms of, if you have a standard remediation window of X number of days, right? Most of those vulnerabilities would go past due and end up lingering on the backlog because of that rolling cycle. And so if you think about it, they've already accepted, and unfortunately this wasn't documented, nobody knew about it. I mean, security and IT both agreed that these couldn't be fixed, but it wasn't a broader discussion throughout the organization. And so what that means is we can prioritize 8% of our vulnerabilities. 92% of these vulnerabilities we've said we can't do anything with right now. We should have a plan for that. We should document the plan for that. And then let's prioritize the rest. And what ops sees, the remediation team see is, well, this is the stuff that you can fix. Because if you mix that in with 92% of the things that we can't fix, they're going to be like, well, can't fix that one, can't fix that one. And eventually they're going to say, all right, I got nothing to do. Another example is, we grouped the vulnerabilities by product or by solution for another company. And the number one thing was update flash. Like, that was the number one outstanding vulnerability on their backlog by a huge amount. But we had a 30-minute conversation with the remediation teams and the patch teams, and they're like, well, no, we don't have any problem patching Flash. I'm like, well, is the data wrong? Like, what's going on here? Like, no, it's not Flash. You see item number 7 on your report there, Google Chrome. That's the problem. We have a business application that relies on an old version of Chrome. Chrome bundles Flash. For every Chrome CVE for that version, there's 3 or 4 Flash vulnerabilities associated with that bundled version of Flash. Until we can upgrade that version of Chrome, we can't get rid of those. But again, not documented, like not well known throughout the organization. And so it's like, let's get those off the report. And the cool thing about that is I've kept in touch with this organization, and they were able to go through like a 6-7 month project to upgrade that application, get rid of it, and their vulnerability backlog dropped by millions of vulnerabilities overnight once they were able to get rid of that old version of Chrome. So that huge impact by digging down to that root cause and then funding a project to make major change within the organization. Once you find all those root cause issues, all that technical debt, as was mentioned in the chat, once we identify all that and have a plan for it, yeah, let's prioritize everything else, because that has a lot of value to the organization for reducing the most amount of risk.
Great examples that really helps put it together, I think, for everyone listening. Steve, I know you had something to add, I think, here too still.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I see the same things, and I've always seen the same things, where root cause analysis is something that just kind of happens informally and just kind of organically among people. It's not really, in most organizations, a formal part of their process or their vulnerability management program. And I think it is a huge lost opportunity and probably risk if root cause analysis isn't being performed on a regular basis more formally, because those things that David's talking about that were identified can have such a massive impact, both in terms of risk reduction, cost savings, and everything else. So yeah, I think it's becoming more critical that organizations start doing this type of analysis, because one of the things I've noticed is that some organizations, and I think David was making this point earlier as well, with the volume of new vulnerabilities that are constantly being announced and published, and the IT complexity and everything else that's constantly increasing, a lot of organizations are investing heavily in their programs, and then they're watching their metrics and KPIs and whatnot, and they're just kind of flat. In some cases, they actually are going down. They're like, well, what's going on? I'm making more of an investment, I'm making a concerted effort, and I'm not getting, the results aren't reflecting that. And so I think a big part of that is that they're missing that opportunity of some root cause analysis, and they're just struggling to keep up with all the new vulnerabilities and all the new technology their enterprise is rolling out. And so I think good root cause analysis will be key in the future to just really kind of unblocking and unlocking performance.
Great, thank you. You brought up a topic for another question I had for David around technology. In a recent webinar, David, you shared that the secret to vulnerability management is better technology management, and security incidents don't hurt. What did you mean by this, and what does better technology management look like?
Oh, that's that last bit you added on is the one.
Count on me for that.
Oh, I got to go back to my consulting lingo and say, well, it depends, right? But dealing with how I think I mentioned this earlier, but how we build and deploy and update and change systems is going to stop the bleeding, right? If we can figure out a way to more consistently, more easily update and manage systems. And I'll just give some examples. I have some clients, some of them that are higher performing, and to be fair, some of the companies that I'm talking about they don't have the same difficulties as some larger companies. And so this isn't going to be feasible for every company, because just of the makeup, right? They don't have as many unique systems. They're not dealing with quite as many legacy systems as some of the companies, the larger enterprises. But these are big companies, and they've basically taken a playbook from containerization, where containers are immutable. You don't change a container, you replace a container. And so what they do is even for their non-containerized infrastructure, since we do have cloud and virtualization now that lends itself to automation, you don't change a system post-deployment, you replace it. And it requires teams to get better test coverage because they're constantly redeploying their application. It forces them to go through that process of change more often so that they get better at it, and you have fewer failures over time. And so what they do is they make rules like you can only run an instance in AWS or a virtual machine in Azure for 2 weeks, and then it's got to be replaced. Now you can replace it more often than every 2 weeks, but every 2 weeks it's got to be replaced. And we're consistently going through and updating and managing our images so that fresh new system is patched and updated, which is why they have to have good test coverage. I got to make sure that the application that I deploy on top of that system is still going to function when I deploy it with that new image. And so there's a whole process and a whole like transformation that has to take place to get there. But those are the few of my clients that like they're now searching for the little things that are still plaguing them, that are maybe the 5-year effort to kind of get rid of it, the really legacy, like ingrained Snowflake systems. So they still have some really large problems to solve, but they're at least not adding on to those problems anymore. Now that's one approach. I'm not saying that's the only approach, and it only works for certain systems, right? You're not going to redeploy your database server every week or every 2 weeks. That's not going to happen. And so then thinking through, okay, well, what do we do for the systems that can't follow that more immutable approach, or if we don't want to, or if we can't follow that immutable design, then what do we do instead? And that's where, cloud really helps, because if we leverage that shared responsibility model, cloud providers tend to be doing a good job of patching and updating those platform as a service databases. And so if we can, for systems that aren't too sensitive, leverage a cloud provider for that, then that frees us up to manage the few systems that we're not comfortable putting into the cloud or adding to platform as a service.
Awesome.
I've got to say this this whole conversation reminds me, if I don't know if anyone in the audience, I'm sure a ton of you have heard of a guy named Sunil Yu, and he talks about an analogy of pets versus cattle when we're talking about container images. So if you haven't checked that out, it's any of his, he's done some keynotes and a lot of blogging on it. But the whole concept is, you should basically treat containers kind of like cattle, and basically shoot them in the head when they're damaged or vulnerable. Sorry to all you animal lovers out there, but you might not want to read that. But I'll definitely maybe I'll just drop the link in Slack here, because it's completely relevant to, or in Zoom here, because it's completely relevant to this topic.
Yeah,
Awesome.
and going back to like that's one of many solutions. So if we want a traditional approach to patching and configuring systems, there's still plenty of tools out there that can help us with that, right? There are ways to accomplish that. It's just being willing to acknowledge our faults, which is sometimes hard to do, because like we may even acquire something to help us with the process or the project that we're trying to complete, and then it ends up not working. Are we willing to admit that that's not the right solution and go back and ask for funding to fix it? Because that takes courage to go back and say, we screwed up. We thought we were making the right decision, but it's obviously leading us off track. It's not working. It's not functioning in our environment. And so we need to go back and make a switch. And sometimes that was with technology, sometimes it's with people, sometimes it's with process. We need to learn from the move away from waterfall to agile to like, let's make incremental, smaller changes where maybe the pain is not quite as big if we do fail, but we can go back to the drawing board and make it better, right? And part of that is making sure that we're engaging with our stakeholders enough to get their feedback on what's working and what's not working. Like, we can't just be this department up on a hill that looks down on the organization and shouts directives at everybody to do things, right? We've got to be collaborative with all of these groups that we're asking to do things and be open to their feedback so that we can get better as well in helping them be more effective and helping them get support for change and support for technology and people and process. Because ultimately that helps us, right? Even though that's not our budget, it's not our project, like, they're the ones doing the work and we can't succeed without their work. And so how do we help them help us?
Awesome. So we're nearing the last quarter of this webinar. We are determined to leave it on a high. So if you're still here with us, just hang out. We've got some resources for you, and I promise a little bit of fun right at the end as well. There are two areas I still want to touch on before we get off this call, because we promised it as part of this session. And so I will throw it out. I will make it a free for all. Whoever wants to go at it, go at it. Let's try to stay under 10 minutes for both of these though. But here's the first one. Why is exception tracking so important? So I don't know who wants it or wants to start.
David, I know you've got, well, I'll give you a break. You did go. Scott, would you like to go first? I mean, I'm happy to go. I feel like I'm doing too much talking here.
Oh no, man, I love listening to you talk. You go for it, man. I'll also chip in.
Exception tracking. Okay, so I think that having a process to track and manage exceptions is important because in most cases, not all cases, but most cases, exceptions represent risk acceptance. And, you have to keep a record of risk acceptance so that you can understand what your current risk profile is, right? That kind of goes without saying. So you can reevaluate risk periodically that you've accepted, so that you can communicate to auditors where you've kind of deviated from policies and whatnot that your organization has committed to. So yeah, I think it's basically, kind of important for very similar reasons to just, the reasons why risk management in general is important. And yeah, risk isn't black and white. You can't fix everything. You can never, that will never work. And that's, it's just not realistic or feasible. So you have to have an exception process and risk acceptance processes along with that. But yeah, what do you guys think?
Yeah, well, to build on that, I think that exceptions is one way of drilling into some of the root cause issues that we have in our environment. Why can't we resolve certain types of vulnerabilities faster than others? And so if we can drill into the types of exceptions and have a good, like a finite but a good list of reasons why they're requesting the exceptions that can help us get to that root cause faster. The other nice thing about exceptions is, in order for our reports to be meaningful, our timelines or requirements have to be achievable. But recognizing that what's achievable for one group may not be achievable for all groups or all systems, having those exceptions is a way of acknowledging where we can't move as fast or we can't do things as well one way. And so it keeps our reports from all being read all the time and allows us to handle the larger issues as part of a separate side process, right? Where we're not bogging down with operations having like an F on their reports all the time because there's things out of their control that they can't do to resolve these vulnerabilities. And so it makes it more fair to those teams because they are making progress, they are doing things that makes it so that effort's not hidden by all of these undocumented exceptions. And then to Steve's point on risk acceptance, like if there's a big enough grouping of exceptions that has a similar cause, that should be like a globally recognized risk. That should go on the corporate risk register. Now, not every vulnerability, but these large groupings of exceptions that we can't fix, right? That should be a globally recognized risk so that we get the support and the funding that we need, maybe some special projects to resolve that over time.
Great. And that was perfect because you did 5 minutes out of the 10. So second area, and I will make it another free for all, is what are some of the most useful metrics and reports for operations? This is going to be a challenge because we've got like 5 minutes for this, but what should, organizations report on or track over time? There's been a lot of questions in the chat about this as well. What should they be using for this? So I will open it up to whoever wants to take that.
So real quick, I'll just say, because I don't know if David was going to plug it or not, but I think it's the first page of the SANS vulnerability management maturity model has a whole bunch of really good metrics. Not all of them are vulnerability management related, but I think I don't know, maybe half of them are, 4 or 5 of them are. And so I, off the top of my head, I don't remember what they all are, but I would recommend that everyone go out and look at that because I remember
share
them
it shortly.
They're really good. And I think that they also, if I recall, tie into different levels of maturity. So they're like, hey, if you're kind of in an early stage of building a vulnerability management program, these are the type of metrics you might want to think about implementing. And then as you build up, there's some more advanced metrics. But of course, I think of like mean time to resolve vulnerabilities, mean exposure time. So kind of just different way of measuring how long vulnerabilities have existed on your network. Whether or not you detected them right away is a different question. So exposure is kind of something you want to look closely at. But then to me, looking at vulnerabilities that are exceeding your SLA thresholds, so breaching your SLAs, like those are things that to me are really important. From a maturity perspective, you want defined SLAs. Not all organizations even have that yet, but that's okay. But once you define them, measuring over time, to what degree you're breaching SLAs is a great one. But I'll pause there and give these other guys a chance to talk.
Yeah, well, I can tell you what we're seeing in the market as well, right? And then we'll let David. We'll let you. I
was gonna say, let me clean up with whatever time's left.
Right, we're just gonna play the pieces out there, and you just wipe the table. So, like, I will say that all of these, I break them down into what I call basic metrics, and then like the more advanced versions of those metrics. Like every metric has kind of levels that you can measure against it, right? So, for example, mean time to remediate. That's awesome, great to have at point in time. But when you get to like the second level, it's breaking down your mean time to remediate across maybe different teams or different parts of your business unit. And then level 3 would being able to do all of that, but then being able to do that on a trend over time. So you could say, hey, this team is getting better or worse over time, broken down by the way that we do risk prioritization. So we can have a mean time to remediate for critical severity CVSS scores, or, if you're using threat intel formed risk scoring, you could say, hey, based on the categories of risk, broken down by team over time, what's our mean time to remediate? So you can get really complex and advanced with some of these metrics. And so I would say when we think about metrics, there's there's the basic versions of them. So, SLAs, as Steve mentioned, SLAs over time. There's things like, hey, mean time to remediate is all the normal stuff that you expect as well. But it's a lot around how are we trending over time? And then how is that broken down across your organization to drive change is where we start to see tons of additional value, and where it gets really hard really fast on how do you actually track this, because it's a lot of data, there's a lot of actions, a lot of outcomes, a lot of communication that's necessary. So it's when you try to go from level 1 to level 2 of these metrics is where it becomes really challenging, is what we're seeing.
All right, really quick. The way that I look at it, there's different types of metrics, and I'll talk about the high level categories, and then there's different stakeholder groups that need to see different things. And so let me briefly touch on that. There's contextual metrics. These are metrics that come from systems and processes that are outside of our direct control, but they add context and flavor to what we're doing with our tools. Then there's operational metrics. Those are ones that are coming directly from our vulnerability management processes and technologies. And then there are the contextual, operational, and kind of program level metrics that are kind of the higher level of the contextual and technical metrics, kind of looking at it to measure our program performance. And then, there's different stakeholder groups. We've got the ops teams, and there, if we can get, like Scott was mentioning, very focused owner-based reports, like this is your top 10 list. This is your most common exception. This is information that we can give to those teams so that they can do their job better, but also provide feedback on what's not working more easily than if they're getting a boatload of vulnerabilities that they don't own or they don't manage the systems for. And they need the ability to drill down to the details, right? So that they can dig in and find the issues. That might not be the first view, or we might want to summarize it so that it streamlines their jobs, but they do need the detail at some point. The program level, that's where we start to get the trends, as Scott was mentioning. We have the trending patterns and things like that. Maybe like a scorecard where we're starting to measure different groups against one another so we can find the high performers and low performers. There's value for identifying both of those groups so that we can get them talking to each other. And then the executive metrics, which may include some scorecards, but at a higher level, a larger risk score with some normalized trending, right? So maybe not a graph where they can see every patch Tuesday that things spike, but need to know directionally how the organization is going at a higher level.
Awesome. Thank you, David.
I don't want to.
Just in time.
Yeah.
Just in time. So really quick, because you've asked, I've actually answered some really serious questions. So I'll ask you each one fun one in a rapid fire round before we close. David, love or friendship?
Love.
Steve, money or happiness?
Sorry, I was on mute. Happiness, 1000%.
All right. And Scott, do you use your own streaming accounts or borrow someone else's?
Depends on the streaming accounts. I'm going to neither confirm nor deny that. Although I will say in the future, I will. Netflix is changing that, so future, my own for sure.
Yes, they
are.
You
would know, Scott. You would know.
All right, perfect. Well, I love that. Hopefully that left everyone on a high note. As we approach the end of this session, we'd like to share a little more information about a few of the topics that we touched on today, including the SANS VM maturity model, David's vulnerability management course and company, Next Level3. Next Level3 and their account protection service provides just-in-time access for any user or role. Feel free to reach out to David directly on LinkedIn or to set up a POC or learn more about any of these 3 topics using the direct links in the chat box or the QR codes that are on this slide right now. And now we have reached the end of this session. We hope that you've learned at least one thing that you can walk away with today. You're welcome to connect with any of us on LinkedIn to keep the discussion going or to learn more about Nucleus Security. Our unified vulnerability management platform supports and enables risk-based vulnerability management at scale. With Nucleus, teams are empowered to work fast and focused with smart automation that simplifies and immediately expedites the whole vulnerability management process and transforms your program no matter where you are today in a short period of time. If you found this session especially helpful, have ideas for future topics, or know someone that we should invite as a guest speaker, you're welcome to send that feedback to me directly via LinkedIn as well. If we weren't able to get to your questions today, we'll follow up or may do a follow-up session as mentioned earlier in the coming months. As part of our follow-up, you'll receive content to further support your quest towards better vulnerability management and the on-demand recording for this session. And then our next webinar will be taking place on June 28th at 9 a.m. Eastern, where we'll discuss enterprise vulnerability prioritization methods with our partner and customer, Orange Cyber Defense. A huge thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Steve, Scott, and David. And an even bigger thank you to all of you that attended today. Have a great rest of your day and week. We look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. And I had 30 seconds to spare. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you.